I sat behind my cluttered desk, the gentle hum of the ceiling fan breaking the silence in my tiny office. The pale sunlight streamed through the dusty window blinds, casting faint lines across my worn notebook. Business had been slow lately. I tapped my pen against the desk, glancing at the clock for the third time that morning. Where are all the customers today? I thought, shaking my head. Just as I was about to give in to boredom, the familiar creak of the door snapped me back to attention. Ben walked in, his face lighting up with the same sly grin I'd come to expect from him. Ben was my connection to the world of high-paying clients. He always seemed to know where the money was, and he never hesitated to take his share. "Kristen," he said, plopping down in the chair across from me, "I've got something big for you." I leaned forward, curiosity sparking in my chest. "Big, huh? Let's hear it." "Rich client. Loaded," Ben began, his voice dropping into a conspiratorial tone. "Name's Rollick. Lives in a mansion out in the countryside. Needs it redesigned pronto." "And?" I prompted, folding my arms. "What's the catch?" "No catch. Just gotta impress him first. You know the drill," he said, leaning back and crossing his legs casually. "I'll set it up so it looks like you two meet by chance. He's got a thing for natural encounters." "Ben," I sighed, narrowing my eyes at him, "do you ever bring me clients who aren't an uphill battle?" Ben chuckled. "Where's the fun in that? Anyway, this guy's worth it. Pays 5 times the usual rate." 5 times. That caught my attention. I didn't need more convincing. "All right," I said. "What's the plan?" He grinned, rubbing his hands together like a magician about to reveal a trick. "Rollick visits the park near his mansion every morning. You'll be there too. I'll point him out, and you'll, well, bump into him. Literally." I raised an eyebrow but nodded. "Fine. Let's do it." The park was quiet, with only a few joggers scattered along the pathways. The crisp morning air carried the faint scent of dew and blooming flowers. I pulled my ponytail tighter, my nerves flickering like static. I wasn't sure if it was the caffeine from my morning coffee or the fact that I was about to accidentally run into a complete stranger. Ben's voice crackled in my earpiece. "All right, Kristen. Black outfit, tall guy, sharp jawline. That's him." I spotted him instantly. Rollick was breathtaking, even from a distance. His black shirt fit perfectly, highlighting his broad shoulders, and his stride was unhurried yet commanding. There was a magnetic charm about him, like he didn't have to try to make the world notice him. It just did. "Showtime," Ben whispered. I took a deep breath and started jogging toward him. As I approached, I picked up the pace slightly and pretended to lose focus. With precision that only practice could master, I collided into him, and we both toppled to the ground. "Oh my gosh, I'm so sorry!" I exclaimed, scrambling to sit up and brushing imaginary dirt off my leggings. Rollick stood effortlessly, extending a hand toward me. His touch was firm yet gentle as he helped me up. "No harm done," he said, his deep voice warm with a hint of amusement. I smoothed my hair, avoiding his piercing blue gaze. "I didn't see you there," I said, faking embarrassment. "I guess I was too caught up in my run." Rollick's lips curled into a small smile. "It happens. I'm Rollick, by the way." "I'm Kristen," I replied, offering a hand. "I'm an interior designer." He raised an eyebrow, his smile widening slightly. "Is that so?" Before I could gauge his interest, he nodded politely and walked away, leaving me standing there with my heart pounding. "Not interested," I told Ben later, slumping into my office chair. He barely said a word. "Patience," Ben replied, leaning against the doorway. "It's not that easy, Kristen. But trust me, the payoff is worth it. You'll just have to try harder." And try harder, I did. Later that evening, as I was walking home, I spotted a man sitting on the sidewalk, his clothes tattered and his hair wild. He looked up at me with hollow, sea-green eyes that spoke of days without food. My heart ached. "Wait here," I told him, darting into a nearby diner. I bought a sandwich and handed it to him. "Here, eat this." "Thank you," he murmured, his voice barely audible. "I'm James," I smiled. "I'm Kristen. Take care of yourself, all right?" The next morning, I brought James breakfast and a little cash. He seemed more alive, his eyes brighter. "You didn't have to do this," he said, looking at me with genuine gratitude. "You'll pay it forward someday," I replied. That evening, I saw him again. He had trimmed his hair and cleaned up. "I'm going to find work," he said. "You've inspired me." I felt a warmth spread through me, one that no amount of money could buy. "I'm glad," I said simply, and we shared a laugh over his determination to start fresh. As I sat in my apartment that night, I felt a strange mix of anticipation and contentment. Rollick's mansion loomed in my thoughts, a challenge I was determined to conquer. But James's smile stayed with me too, a reminder that even the smallest gestures could change someone's world. The morning sun painted the sky a soft orange as I drove up the winding path to Rollick's mansion. The air grew colder the closer I got, and by the time I reached the enormous iron gates, it felt as if I'd entered another world. The mansion stood tall and proud, its weathered exterior giving it a mysterious charm. It was the kind of place you'd see in a movie, the kind that whispered secrets through its walls. Rollick greeted me at the grand entrance, his black shirt unbuttoned at the collar, revealing just enough to catch my eye. His blue eyes sparkled like the morning dew on grass, and his polite smile made me feel noticed. "Kristen," he said, extending his hand. "Welcome. I hope the drive wasn't too much trouble." "Not at all," I replied, shaking his hand briefly. His touch was cool, firm, and steady, a reflection of the man himself, I assumed. The moment I stepped inside, I was speechless. The mansion was both breathtaking and eerie. The ceilings soared high above, with chandeliers hanging like frozen waterfalls. Every step I took echoed faintly, the sound swallowed by the vastness of the space. Rich tapestries clung to the walls, their colors faded with time, and antique furniture stood like silent witnesses to a bygone era. Rollick guided me through the hallways, explaining his vision for the redesign. "This room," he said, gesturing to a large sitting area with worn velvet couches, "needs more light. I want it to feel alive again." I nodded, taking notes on my tablet, but my mind wandered. There was something about this place. It felt heavy, as if the air itself carried a weight I couldn't explain. As I stepped out of the mansion later that day, the sun was dipping low, painting the trees in fiery hues. I paused near the driveway to take in the view when I felt it, a presence. My skin prickled, and I turned sharply toward the trees lining the path. "Hello?" I called out, but there was no response, just the rustling of leaves as the wind picked up. I squinted, trying to see past the shadows. I could have sworn someone had been watching me. Near the road where I usually found James, I saw him pacing, his movements sharp and uneasy. His shirt, though clean, was slightly crumpled, and his sea-green eyes darted toward me as I approached. "James, what's wrong?" I asked, genuinely concerned. "I was the one watching you," he blurted out, running a hand through his hair. "I didn't mean to scare you, but I had to warn you. That mansion, Kristen, it's cursed." I blinked, taken aback. "Cursed? James, what are you talking about?" He shook his head, frustration evident in his voice. "I don't know the details, but I've heard enough to know it's not safe. You shouldn't go back there." I sighed, touched by his concern, but unsure of what to make of his words. "James, I appreciate you looking out for me, but I'll be fine. It's just a house." "Promise me you'll be careful," he pleaded, his eyes searching mine for reassurance. "I promise," I said softly, placing a hand on his arm. "Thank you for caring." The next day, I returned to the mansion, this time with a small team of designers I'd hired for the project. As we worked, I noticed something strange etched into the floor near the grand staircase, a symbol I didn't recognize. It looked ancient, almost ritualistic, with intricate lines that seemed to twist and turn endlessly. "What's this?" I asked Rollick, pointing to the symbol. He glanced at it briefly, then shrugged. "No idea. It's an old house. Probably just some decorative nonsense from the previous owners." His nonchalant tone didn't sit right with me, but I let it go. I had a job to do, and I wasn't about to let a strange marking derail it. Throughout the day, I couldn't ignore the way Rollick's attention lingered on me. He found excuses to check in on my progress, his charming smile and soft-spoken words making it harder to focus. At one point, he leaned closer than necessary to look at my sketches. His scent, a mix of cedar wood and something darker, filling the space between us. "You're very talented," he said, his voice low and smooth. "I can see why Ben recommended you." "Thank you," I replied, trying to keep my tone professional, though my pulse quickened. Rollick had a way of making you feel like the center of the universe, and I wasn't immune to it. Still, my focus remained on the work. A part of me couldn't ignore the thought that if Rollick took a genuine interest in me, it could change my life entirely. But was that ambition or something deeper whispering in my mind? The next morning, just as I was about to leave for work, there was a knock at my door. I opened it to find James standing there, but he looked different. His hair was neatly cut, and he wore a simple button-down shirt that actually fit him well. He looked like a new man, though his warm smile was the same. "James?" I said, surprised. "What a surprise." "Morning," he said, shuffling slightly. "I was wondering if you'd like to grab some coffee. My treat. I got a job at a garage and, well, I'd like to celebrate." I smiled, genuinely happy for him. "That's amazing, James, but I have to get to work. How about we celebrate this evening?" He hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "All right, I'll wait." As I watched him walk away, a small pang of guilt tugged at me. James's kindness was rare, and I hoped I wasn't taking it for granted. Still, as I drove back to the mansion, I couldn't shake the feeling that the lines between my ambitions and my heart were beginning to blur. When I arrived at Rollick's mansion that morning, he was already standing by the grand entrance, dressed impeccably as always. His polished shoes gleamed under the faint rays of the early sun, and his dark blue blazer hugged his tall frame just right. The moment he saw me, his face lit up with a warm smile that made me feel noticed. He stepped forward, gently taking my hands. "Kristen," he said, his voice low but smooth, "I must say, you're doing extraordinary work. I've never seen anyone with your level of skill and attention to detail." I wasn't used to such direct praise, and I could feel my cheeks warming. "Thank you, Rollick. That means a lot," I managed, my voice steady despite the flutter in my chest. He led me inside, his hands still lightly holding mine, and we walked through the vast halls of the mansion together. The workers had already started setting up their tools and equipment, and the air was filled with the faint smell of sawdust and paint. As I began giving instructions, Rollick stayed close, watching me with what felt like genuine admiration. Around noon, Rollick invited me to join him for lunch in the grand dining room. The table was massive, made of dark oak, with a centerpiece of fresh flowers that smelled faintly of lavender. As we ate, he kept the conversation light, asking about my interests and gently complimenting my talent. "You're truly a rare find, Kristen," he said, his blue eyes locking with mine. "Not just as a designer, but as a person." I laughed softly, tucking a stray strand of hair behind my ear. "You're too kind, Rollick. I'm just doing my job." But deep down, I felt something stir. Could he be falling for me? And was it so wrong to let myself imagine what it might be like if he did? His wealth, his charm. Marrying someone like Rollick would be a dream come true. As the afternoon wore on, I found myself teasing him a little, testing the waters. When I made a playful remark about his strict attention to detail, he laughed, the sound deep and warm. By evening, the workers had packed up for the day, leaving the mansion eerily quiet. Rollick suggested dinner, and I couldn't refuse. The candle-lit meal was intimate, his conversation as smooth as silk. But when it was time to leave, I realized just how late it had gotten. "You shouldn't drive home at this hour," Rollick said, his concern evident. "Please stay here for the night. There's more than enough space, and it's safer." I hesitated, unsure if it was appropriate. But then again, staying would only bring us closer, wouldn't it? "All right," I said with a small smile. "Thank you, Rollick." He led me to a guest room on the second floor. The room was lavish, with a canopy bed, rich velvet curtains, and a vintage dresser that looked like it belonged in a museum. As he bid me goodnight, I suddenly remembered my promise to James. My heart sank. I'd told him I'd meet him for coffee, and now I'd broken that promise. "Tomorrow," I whispered to myself as I closed the door. "I'll make it up to him tomorrow." The mansion was eerily silent that night. Just as I was about to drift off, a faint sound from the hall jolted me awake. It was soft at first, like a shuffle, but it grew louder, more distinct. Curiosity got the better of me, and I slipped out of bed, wrapping a shawl around my shoulders. The hall was dimly lit by a single flickering sconce. My bare feet made no sound on the cold marble as I crept toward the noise. Suddenly, I saw it. A shadowy figure on 4 legs slipping out the main door. My heart raced as I froze in place. An animal? It had to be. Maybe something from the nearby forest. Shaken but unwilling to jump to conclusions, I returned to my room. Sleep didn't come easily, especially when I heard a distant howl echoing through the night. It sounded like a wolf, and it sent shivers down my spine. By morning, the sun poured through the tall windows, chasing away the remnants of the night's unease. Rollick knocked lightly on the door before entering with a tray. "Good morning," he said, his smile as radiant as the sunlight. "Coffee?" I took the cup gratefully, letting the warmth seep into my hands. "Thank you, Rollick. This is very thoughtful of you." As I sipped, a pang of guilt hit me. I had to see James today. After breakfast, I excused myself, promising to return in a couple of hours. When I reached the usual road where James often stayed, he wasn't there. Frowning, I headed home, only to find him lying on the ground near my door. "James!" I called out, rushing to his side. He stirred, blinking up at me. "I waited," he murmured, sitting up slowly. "I thought you'd come, but it got late, so I stayed here." My chest tightened with guilt. "James, I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to break my promise." I helped him inside, introducing him to Ivory, who greeted him kindly. Over coffee, James shared that he'd started working at a garage, but needed a place to stay. "You can stay here," I said impulsively. "At least until you find a place." James looked at me, his green eyes soft with gratitude.
Kristen,
Thank you. That means a lot. Ivory agreed, and we set up a temporary bed for him in the living room. As James left for work later, I felt a strange sense of relief. Maybe keeping him close was the right thing to do. Living with James and Ivory was like stepping into a strange but warm rhythm. James had taken over the role of our unofficial house caretaker, preparing coffee for Ivory and me every morning. I would often wake up to the sound of cups clinking and the rich aroma of coffee brewing. It was comforting, like a warm blanket on a chilly day. James, with his untidy hair and sea-green eyes, would always greet me with a shy smile. I didn't think much of it back then. To me, he was just my sweet, dependable friend. A little awkward, but kind to the core. Ivory, on the other hand, was her bubbly self. I started noticing how she lingered around James a bit more than usual, laughing at his jokes, even the ones that weren't funny. It amused me, but James didn't seem to notice. His attention was always on me, talking, listening, making me laugh. I thought it was just his way of being a good friend. Meanwhile, Rollick and I were becoming closer. Every time I went to the mansion, he found ways to charm me, whether it was with his smooth words, his warm smiles, or the way he seemed to genuinely care about my work. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the mansion was bathed in golden light, Rollick confessed something that sent my heart racing.
I'm not like everyone else, Kristen,
he said, his blue eyes holding mine.
I'm a werewolf.
For a moment, I didn't know what to say. My heart was pounding so loudly I was sure he could hear it. But then he added softly,
I wouldn't hurt you, Kristen. I love you.
Those words melted away any fear I had. I believed him. Rollick's honesty felt raw and genuine, and I could see in his eyes that he meant every word. I trust you, I whispered, and before I could say anything more, he pulled me into a kiss. It was slow and sweet, like we had all the time in the world. His lips were warm, his touch gentle yet firm. I felt like I was floating, caught between reality and a dream. From that moment, Rollick and I grew even closer. He kissed me often, each kiss carrying the weight of his emotions, and I found myself falling deeper for him. I felt safe with him, cherished. One morning, as I sipped the coffee James had made, I glanced at him standing by the counter. He was wearing a faded shirt and jeans, his hair slightly messy. There was something about the way he avoided meeting my eyes that made me curious. James, I said, setting my cup down. Are you okay? He looked up quickly, forcing a smile.
Of course. Why wouldn't I be?
I shrugged, letting it go. James had always been a bit reserved. It was part of his charm, I thought, though I never really understood him completely. As days passed, James and I became better friends. He made it his mission to make me laugh, often doing silly things or telling stories from his days on the streets. Sometimes, when he thought I wasn't looking, I'd catch him staring at me, his sea-green eyes filled with something I couldn't quite place. But I brushed it off. To me, he was my best friend, my confidant, not someone I saw romantically. Then came the day everything changed. Over breakfast, with Ivory and James sitting across from me, I broke the news. James, Ivory, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. I'm getting married. Ivory's face lit up instantly. Oh my God, Kristen, that's amazing, she exclaimed, practically bouncing in her chair. James, however, froze. His smile faltered, and for a moment his expression was unreadable. Then he forced a grin, nodding.
That's great, Kristen. Congratulations.
But I could see it in his eyes, a hollow emptiness, like he had just lost something precious. My chest tightened, but I didn't dwell on it. James had always been supportive, and I assumed he'd come around. That evening, while Ivory went out for a walk, James stayed behind. I left to pack some things, but when I returned, I found him in my room, holding my diary. "James!" I gasped, snatching it from his hands. "What are you doing?"
"I'm sorry,"
he mumbled, his voice shaky.
"I didn't mean to, but I saw something. Kristen, there's something about Rollick you need to know."
My heart sank.
"What are you talking about?"
He hesitated, then pointed to a page I had written weeks ago.
"This," he said. "The symbol. The one Rollick asked you to change."
I frowned, flipping to the page. I had almost forgotten about it. "It's just some family tradition," I said, shrugging. "Why are you so worked up about it?"
"Because,"
James said, his voice barely above a whisper,
"it's not just a symbol. It's a curse. If you marry him, Kristen, that curse could affect you."
I stared at him, my mind racing.
"That's ridiculous, James." "Please,"
he said, his eyes pleading.
"Just be careful. I can't let anything happen to you."
His words lingered in the air, heavy with emotion. For the first time, I saw something in James I hadn't before, an intensity, a vulnerability that made my chest tighten. "James," I said softly, "I'm fine. Rollick would never hurt me." But as I lay in bed that night, his words echoed in my mind. Could there be some truth to what he was saying? The thought unsettled me, but I pushed it aside. I trusted Rollick. Didn't I? The next morning, James was unusually quiet. He handed me my coffee without a word, his sea-green eyes avoiding mine. Ivory, ever oblivious, chatted away about her plans for the day. I tried to focus, but my thoughts kept drifting back to James, to Rollick, and to the symbol on the floor of the mansion. Something didn't feel right, and for the first time, doubt began to creep into my heart. I couldn't believe how quickly my life had turned into a storm, one I didn't see coming. Days ago, everything felt surreal but exciting, like the start of a fairy tale. Now it felt more like a trap I'd willingly stepped into, and every move seemed to push me further into darkness. After throwing James out of my apartment, I tried to convince myself that my anger was justified. Ivory had told me things that made my blood boil. "James thinks you can sleep with anyone," she'd whispered, her voice dripping with concern. I didn't even question her words. I was blinded by rage. James, a beggar I'd taken in, daring to think of me that way? The thought made my stomach churn. The memory of his tear-filled eyes as I yelled at him haunted me, though. His face, etched with shock and pain, flashed in my mind every time I closed my eyes. But I pushed it away, convincing myself that he deserved it. Or so I thought. Rollick, on the other hand, became my escape. He had a way of calming me, his deep blue eyes holding promises I desperately wanted to believe. His touch was always warm, his kisses soft and persuasive. When he proposed, I said yes, thinking maybe this was what love should feel like. He was handsome, charming, and everything seemed perfect, or at least it should have. But something about Rollick's mansion unsettled me. His insistence on me rearranging symbols and furniture under the guise of family tradition lingered in the back of my mind. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to it than he let on. The day Rollick and I moved forward with wedding plans, Ivory came to visit me. She seemed oddly cheerful, more so than usual. "Kristen, you're glowing," she said, sitting across from me at the small dining table in the apartment.
I guess I should be. Rollick and I are making things official, I replied, trying to match her energy. That's wonderful, she said. But there was something in her smile that felt off. Is James okay? I found myself asking out of the blue. Ivory's expression faltered for a second before she quickly recovered. Why are you thinking about him? After what he said, I wouldn't give him another thought. Her words reminded me of the anger I felt when I first heard her accusation, but a part of me, one I tried to ignore, questioned why James would say such a thing. It didn't fit the man I knew, the one who brewed my morning coffee and quietly listened when I vented about life. Later that evening, I found myself pacing in the mansion's grand hall, the symbols on the floor catching my eye again. The golden glow of the chandelier reflected off the strange designs, making them shimmer like something alive. Why do these symbols bother me so much? I muttered to myself. Kristen, everything okay? Rollick's voice broke my thoughts. I turned to see him standing by the doorway, his hands tucked casually into his pockets. He looked perfect as always, his tailored suit accentuating his broad shoulders and lean frame. But his perfection felt calculated now. Yeah, I'm fine, I said quickly. He stepped closer, his presence commanding as always. You're not having second thoughts, are you? His tone was light, but there was an edge to it that made my skin prickle. No, I said, forcing a smile. Just a little nervous, I guess. He cupped my face in his hands, his touch gentle but firm. There's nothing to be nervous about. I'll take care of you. Always. The night before the wedding, everything unraveled. I stumbled upon a hidden drawer in one of the rooms while searching for a shawl. Inside, I found old letters and journal entries, all written in a language I couldn't understand. But one thing was clear, a recurring symbol, the same one I'd been asked to remove and replace. My heart raced as I pieced it together. The symbols weren't just decorations or traditions. They meant something dangerous. And I was a part of it. When I confronted Rollick, his mask slipped. You were never meant to know, he said, his voice cold and detached. What do you mean? I demanded, my voice shaking. He stepped closer, his shadow looming over me. This is bigger than you, Kristen. You should feel honored. You're saving my family. Saving? By becoming cursed? His expression darkened. You're overthinking this. We'll be fine. Together. Together? I backed away, my breath coming in short, sharp gasps. You used me, Rollick. You don't love me. He grabbed my wrist, his grip unyielding. You're not leaving. The days that followed were a nightmare. Rollick kept me confined to the mansion, his once gentle demeanor now cold and calculating. He'd eat in front of me, his smirk daring me to protest. When I asked for water, he ignored me, his eyes glinting with satisfaction as I grew weaker. I realized then that Rollick didn't care about me. He cared about his freedom, and I was just a means to an end. One evening, as I sat by the window, staring out at the sprawling grounds I couldn't escape, I thought of James. His quiet kindness, his unspoken feelings, the way he looked at me as if I were the center of his world. I'd thrown him out, humiliated him, and for what? A man who saw me as nothing more than a tool? My chest tightened with regret, and tears streamed down my face. I knew I had to escape, but Rollick was always watching, always waiting. The mansion, once beautiful and enchanting, now felt like a gilded cage. My heart ached, not just for my freedom, but for the choices I'd made, the people I'd hurt, the lies I'd believed. And in that moment, I made a silent vow. I would fight back, not just for myself, but for the part of me that still believed in love kindness, and second chances. I would find a way out. I woke up to the sound of my own breath, short, fast, like I'd just run a mile. My body was trembling, drenched in sweat, and my heart felt like it would beat out of my chest. It wasn't just a bad dream. It was something more. James was there, in my dream. His sea-green eyes locked onto mine, filled with urgency. He wasn't the soft, quiet man I remembered. There was a power in his voice, a strength I hadn't seen before.
"Kristen, you're not as weak as you think,"
He'd said, his voice firm but gentle.
"You have something inside you. Your speed. Use it. Trust yourself."
But when I tried to ask him how to escape or what to do, the dream faded, leaving me more confused than ever. I sat up on the small cot Rollick had put me in. My hands instinctively touched the cold metal bars of the cage he'd locked me in after our last fight. The room smelled faintly of wood polish and something metallic, maybe blood. I was so hungry that even the stale crumbs on the floor looked tempting, but I couldn't bring myself to touch them. I hated how weak I'd become. My hands shook, not just from hunger, but from exhaustion. My body ached, every muscle screaming at me to give up, but my mind wouldn't let me. James's words echoed in my head.
"You have something inside you."
Rollick walked in not long after. He always had this air of confidence about him, like he knew he had already won. His blue eyes scanned me from head to toe, a smirk playing on his lips.
"Still sulking?"
he asked, leaning casually against the doorway. His shirt was slightly unbuttoned, revealing the sharp line of his collarbone. He looked every bit the perfect, polished man he pretended to be, but I saw the cracks now. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to smile, a soft, hesitant one that I hoped seemed real. "I've been thinking," I said, my voice low.
"Oh?"
He raised an eyebrow, stepping closer. "About us," I continued, letting my gaze drop to the floor like I was shy. Maybe I've been wrong. Maybe I've been fighting something that I shouldn't." His smirk widened, and he crouched down in front of the cage, his face inches from mine.
"What are you saying, Kristen?"
I hesitated, biting my lip. "I'm saying I don't want to fight anymore. Maybe I could love you, Rollick." The way his eyes lit up told me I'd hit the right nerve. He believed me, or at least he wanted to. I felt a pang of disgust at the act I was putting on, but I pushed it aside. This was my only chance. That evening, Rollick brought me out of the cage. For the first time in days, I wasn't trapped behind bars. He even shared a meal with me. A lavish spread of roasted chicken, fresh bread, and wine. My stomach growled at the sight, and I forced myself to eat slowly, even though I wanted to devour everything in front of me.
"You seem different,"
he said, watching me closely as I sipped the wine. I smiled softly, setting the glass down. "I think I was scared before. But you've shown me. I don't have to be." Rollick reached across the table, taking my hand in his. His touch was warm, almost gentle, but I couldn't forget what he was capable of.
"I knew you'd come around,"
he said, his voice low. I swallowed hard, nodding. I just needed time. That night, as Rollick slept, I made my move. I tiptoed into his room, my heart pounding in my chest. The dim light from the moon filtered through the curtains, casting shadows across his bed. He looked peaceful, his chest rising and falling steadily under the covers. I crept closer, my hands trembling as I reached for the lamp on the nightstand. It was heavy, solid brass, enough to knock him out if I hit him hard enough. But as I brought it down, the bed exploded in a flurry of blankets and pillows. I froze, realizing too late that it had been a trap. Before I could react, Rollick grabbed me from behind, his arms like iron around my waist. I struggled, kicking and clawing, but he was too strong. He threw me to the floor, and I landed hard, the breath knocked out of me.
Did you really think I wouldn't see through your little act?
He sneered, standing over me. His shirt was rumpled now, his hair slightly disheveled, but his eyes burned with fury. I glared up at him, my chest heaving. "You don't love anyone except yourself," I spat, my voice shaking with anger. Rollick laughed, a cold, hollow sound that sent shivers down my spine. "Love? That's rich coming from you. You're just as selfish as I am, Kristen. The only difference is, I don't pretend to be anything else." He grabbed me by the arm, dragging me back to the cage. My legs felt like jelly, and I couldn't fight him. He locked the door with a loud clang, his smirk returning.
"Nice try, though,"
he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm.
"I almost believed you."
As the days dragged on, I couldn't stop replaying James's words in my mind. I'd been so quick to believe Ivory's lies, so quick to throw him away. But now, trapped and alone, I couldn't help but wonder, what if I'd been wrong? My thoughts swirled with confusion. If James cared about me, why would he say something so disgusting? But then again, why would he warn me about Rollick if he didn't? Nothing made sense anymore. I stared out the small window of the cage, the moonlight casting a faint glow across the room. The full moon was coming, and with it, the wedding. I could feel it. My time was running out. Rollick was waiting for the perfect moment to seal his plan, and I still didn't understand the full extent of what I was up against. All I knew was that I had to get out. Somehow. One evening, as Rollick sat across the room, sipping his wine, I mustered the courage to speak. "Why are you cursed?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. His eyes flicked to me, a shadow passing over his face. For a moment, I thought he wouldn't answer. But then he smiled, a slow, sinister smile that made my blood run cold.
"Curious, are we?"
he said, setting his glass down. He stood, walking over to the cage, his movements slow and deliberate.
"Let's just say,"
he began, crouching down so we were eye level, "I made a deal once, a bad deal, and now I'm paying for it." "With me," I said bitterly. He tilted his head, his smile widening. "Smart girl." That night, as I lay on the cold floor of the cage, I thought about everything that had led me here. James, Ivory, the lies, the choices I'd made. I didn't know how I was going to escape, but one thing was certain. I wasn't going to let Rollick win. I hadn't seen the outside world in over a week. Time seemed to melt in this mansion, with its heavy curtains that kept the sun out, and its endless silence that weighed on me like a shroud. Rollick never let me out of his sight for long, and when he did, the cage always waited for me. But today, something was different.
"Kristen,"
Rollick said, stepping into the room where I sat on the floor by the window, staring out at the bare branches swaying in the winter wind.
"You have a guest."
My heart skipped a beat. A guest? Who could it be? For a moment I dared to hope it was James, but no, that was impossible.
"It's your friend, Ivory,"
Rollick continued, his voice smooth, almost too casual.
"She says she's worried about you."
Ivory? Of course she'd come looking for me. She always kept tabs on me, even when I didn't want her to. My chest tightened at the thought of seeing her. Rollick's sharp gaze lingered on me, and I knew what was coming next.
"Listen carefully,"
he said, leaning closer, his tone dropping to a menacing whisper.
"If you say anything to her about this curse, or about what's happening here,
I will make sure she doesn't leave this house alive." I flinched, but nodded. His threats weren't empty, and I couldn't risk Ivory's life. When I walked into the hall, Ivory was sitting on the velvet couch, looking around the grand room with a mix of awe and curiosity. She wore a red coat, her dark curls framing her face, and she had that same bright, nosy energy that always made me laugh. "Kristen!" she exclaimed, standing up and rushing toward me. Her arms wrapped around me in a tight hug, and for a second, I let myself relax into her warmth. But Rollick's presence loomed behind us like a shadow. I could feel his eyes on me, and it sent a chill down my spine. "You've been hiding out in this mansion for so long," Ivory said, pulling back to look at me. "I was starting to think you'd forgotten about me." I forced a laugh, hoping it sounded real. "You know how it is. Things have been busy." Ivory's dark eyes searched mine, and I could tell she wasn't buying it. She tilted her head slightly, the way she always did when she was trying to figure something out. I quickly looked away, pretending to adjust the sleeve of my sweater. "Let's sit," I said, guiding her back to the couch. My hands were trembling, so I clasped them tightly in my lap to keep her from noticing. Rollick's servant brought in a tray with coffee and small pastries. Ivory chatted away, filling the space with stories about our neighbors and her latest college drama. I nodded and smiled in all the right places, but my mind was racing. How do I tell her without Rollick finding out? Then it hit me. As Ivory reached for her coffee, I leaned in and hugged her again, this time letting my hand slip into her coat pocket. I'd already scribbled everything onto a piece of paper earlier, a desperate plea for help, detailing the curse, the cage, everything. When I pulled back, her eyes narrowed slightly, like she'd felt the movement. But to her credit, she didn't say a word. Instead, she smiled, a soft, knowing smile that gave me a sliver of hope. "So, Kristen," Rollick said suddenly, breaking into our conversation. He leaned against the doorframe, his polished shoes gleaming under the chandelier light. "We should get going soon. The market won't wait." It was his way of telling Ivory to leave. Ivory stood, smoothing out her coat. "Of course. I don't want to keep you two." She turned to me, her expression light, but there was a flicker of something deeper in her eyes. "But you'll let me know if you need anything, right?" "Always," I said, my voice steady despite the lump in my throat. Rollick stepped forward, his charm dialed up as usual. "We'd love for you to come to the wedding. It's the day after tomorrow, right here at the mansion. It'll be unforgettable." Ivory smiled politely, but her eyes darted to me for just a moment. I wouldn't miss it for the world. As she walked out the door, I felt a mix of relief and fear. Relief that she had the note, and fear for what might happen if Rollick found out. Back in the cage, I sat in silence, my fingers gripping the cold bars. I could still feel the warmth of Ivory's hug, the silent understanding in her gaze. I prayed she'd read the note and act quickly, but even as I hoped, doubt crept in. What if Rollick's threats kept her from helping? What if she didn't believe me? Or worse, what if she didn't come back at all? I shook my head, trying to push those thoughts away. For now, all I could do was wait. That night, as I lay on the hard floor, I stared at the ceiling, the faint light of the moon filtering through the high windows. I thought about Ivory's visit, about the way she'd smiled at Rollick even as she slipped out the door with my secret. And for the first time in days, I felt a spark of hope. It was fragile, like a flickering candle in a storm, but it was enough to keep me going. Because no matter how strong Rollick thought he was, I wasn't going to give up, not yet. It was late, so late that the night felt like it was holding its breath. I sat in the dim room of Rollick's mansion, my hands folded tightly in my lap to keep from trembling. My heart thumped heavily in my chest, each beat a countdown to a fate I could barely comprehend. The flickering light from a single lamp cast long, eerie shadows across the walls. They danced and twisted, like phantoms mocking me. I couldn't help but wonder if Ivory would come through for me, or if I was entirely on my own. The thought of Rollick, his piercing blue eyes, his confident smile, made my stomach turn. Everything about him felt like a lie now, a mask hiding the monster Ivory warned me about. I shuddered at the memory of his cold touch on my arm earlier, as he promised that soon I would understand everything. The door creaked open, pulling me from my thoughts. My pulse spiked. Was it Rollick? No, it was a servant. A young man, no older than 20, with nervous eyes and a trembling hand holding something. He stepped into the room cautiously, as if the walls themselves could hear him. "Miss Kristen," he whispered, barely loud enough to be heard. "This is for you." I frowned, my brows knitting together. "What is it?" "It's a letter from Ivory," he said, his voice trembling. His gaze darted toward the door as if he expected Rollick to storm in at any moment. My breath caught in my throat. "Ivory? How did she—" "Please, just take it," he interrupted, thrusting the folded paper at me. "Don't tell Master Rollick. If he finds out—" He didn't finish the sentence, but the fear in his eyes told me enough. I nodded, taking the paper from him. It was wrapped in a small piece of clear plastic, as if to protect it from the elements. My fingers brushed against the servant's briefly, and I could feel the sweat on his skin. He was terrified. "Thank you," I whispered. "I won't say a word." He nodded quickly, then slipped out of the room, leaving the door slightly ajar. The silence that followed was deafening. My hands trembled as I unwrapped the letter. The paper felt rough against my fingertips, and the faint scent of Ivory's perfume lingered on it. It was strangely comforting, even as dread pooled in my stomach. I unfolded the paper and began to read. Ivory's letter. "Kristen, I don't know how to begin this because I don't even know if you'll believe me. But you have to. Please, trust me just this once. Your life depends on it. I found out the truth about Rollick. He's not human, Kristen. He's a werewolf, and he doesn't want to marry you because he loves you. He wants to marry you to transfer a curse that's been haunting his family for generations. The curse is real. His father. The words blurred for a moment as tears filled my eyes. I wiped them away quickly, forcing myself to keep reading. Rollick's father killed a woman he claimed to love. It was an accident, but her death cursed him and his bloodline. The curse says that neither he nor his son will ever find true love, and if anyone dares to love them, they'll meet a tragic end after marriage. The only way to break the curse is to marry a woman who changes the symbol in their mansion during a full moon. I felt like the air had been knocked out of me. My hands clenched the paper so tightly that it crinkled under my fingers. A curse? A werewolf? It sounded like something out of a bad horror movie, but Ivory wouldn't lie about this. Would she? The letter continued. Kristen, I couldn't believe it either. I wanted to convince myself it wasn't true, but the more I learned, the more it made sense. I went to James. He's the only person who cares about you enough to help. I told him everything, about Rollick, the curse, everything. My heart ached at the mention of James. I'd pushed him away, believing lies that Ivory now admitted were her doing. Kristen, I'm so sorry. I let my jealousy blind me. I wanted James for myself, and I thought if I lied, you'd turn away from him. But now I see what a terrible mistake I made. James never said those cruel things about you. He loves you, Kristen. He always has. A sob escaped my throat, and I pressed my hand to my mouth to muffle it. James loved me? We don't have much time. The full moon is in 2 days. James and I are coming to save you. Hold on, Kristen. Please, just hold on. Ivory. I folded the letter back into the plastic and clutched it to my chest. My emotions were a whirlwind. Anger, fear, heartbreak, and above all, hope. Ivory's betrayal hurt, but her words felt sincere. And James. A tear slid down my cheek. James, I whispered. I'm so sorry. I couldn't stop the flood of memories. His shy smile, the way his sea-green eyes lit up when he saw me, the quiet strength he carried even in his poverty. I'd pushed him away, believing he thought so little of me, and now he was risking everything to save me. The door creaked again, and I froze. My heartbeat pounded in my ears as Rollick stepped inside, his polished shoes clicking against the wooden floor. He wore a tailored black suit, the kind that would make any woman swoon, but to me, he looked like a predator sizing up his prey. Kristen, he said smoothly, his voice like velvet. You've been quiet. Thinking about our big day, perhaps? I forced a smile, though my hands trembled behind my back. Yes, I lied. Just nervous, I guess. He tilted his head, studying me like I was a puzzle he couldn't quite solve. Don't be. Everything will be perfect. His words sent a chill down my spine. The morning light filtered through the cracks in the old wooden cage, casting thin rays on my trembling hands. My mind raced as I sat there, trapped and helpless. I could hear the crunch of dry leaves under Rollick's boots as he paced outside the cage. His sharp, polished suit and calm demeanor betrayed no hint of the monstrous intentions Ivory's letter had revealed. His voice cut through the silence. We're leaving, he said coldly, unlocking the cage door. No chances. I can't afford interruptions. Where are you taking me? I demanded, my voice shaky but defiant. To the forest, a place no one will think to look. My heart sank as Rollick's large hand gripped my arm, pulling me out. The damp morning air hit my face, and I struggled against him, but he was too strong. He loaded me into the back of a dark vehicle like luggage, my pleas falling on deaf ears. The drive was short but felt like an eternity. The dense forest loomed ahead, its towering trees like silent witnesses to my dread. Once there, he dragged me deeper into the woods, where the air grew colder and heavier. The chirping of birds faded into an eerie stillness, broken only by the rustle of leaves underfoot. A small clearing opened up ahead, and there it was, a makeshift altar under the ominous shadow of the trees. Rollick chained me to a wooden post beside it, the cold metal biting into my wrists. Stay here, he ordered, his icy blue eyes boring into mine. You'll thank me when it's over. Thank him? The thought made my stomach churn. He didn't love me. He only wanted to use me. The minutes dragged on. Every sound, the snap of a twig, the rustle of leaves, made my pulse quicken. What if Ivory and James found the mansion empty? How could they possibly know where I was? I tugged at the chains, frustration boiling inside me. My breath came out in shallow gasps. The air was heavy with the scent of pine and damp earth. Time felt suspended until, suddenly, a low growl cut through the silence. My head snapped toward the sound. From the shadows emerged a massive werewolf, its fur as black as midnight and its golden eyes glowing with fury. It moved with terrifying grace, each step deliberate, its growls vibrating through the air. Rollick froze, his confidence momentarily shaken. "Who dares?" he began, but before he could finish, the creature lunged at him with a feral roar. The ground shook beneath me as the two clashed. Rollick's features twisted, his human facade peeling away as he shifted into his true form, a werewolf even larger than the one attacking him. Their snarls and the sound of claws tearing through flesh filled the clearing. I barely had time to process what was happening when I heard a familiar voice. "Kristen!" I turned to see Ivory sprinting toward me, her face pale but determined. She held a crowbar, and before I could say anything, she smashed it against the lock on my chains. The metal clanged, and the chains fell loose. "Go!" she urged, pulling me to my feet. "Run!" But I didn't run. Instead, something inside me snapped. Fueled by anger and betrayal, I grabbed a thick branch from the ground and charged toward Rollick. He was too distracted by the other werewolf to notice me at first. I swung the branch with all my strength, striking him across the back. He stumbled but didn't fall. He turned, his glowing eyes narrowing as he saw me. "Kristen, don't!" he growled. But I didn't stop. I struck again, this time aiming for his head. The other werewolf took advantage of his momentary distraction and pounced, sinking its teeth into Rollick's shoulder. Rollick let out a howl of pain, staggering under the combined assault. Finally, he fell, collapsing in a heap on the forest floor. His breathing was ragged, his once menacing presence reduced to nothing more than a broken figure. For a moment, everything was still. The victorious werewolf turned to face me, its golden eyes meeting mine. My heart pounded in my chest. This is it, I thought. This is how it ends. But the creature didn't attack. Instead, it stepped back, its massive form shrinking and contorting until it was no longer a beast, but a man. A familiar man. "James?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. He stood there, his sea-green eyes filled with a mixture of relief and sadness. His clothes were torn, his face and arms covered in scratches, but there was no mistaking him. "Yes, Kristen," he said softly, his voice steady despite his exhaustion. You're a werewolf?" The words felt foreign in my mouth. James nodded, running a hand through his messy hair. "I am. And I've been hiding it from you because you never let me explain." I stared at him, trying to process everything. "You've known Rollick all along?" He sighed, stepping closer. "We were friends as kids. I knew what he was capable of, but I never imagined it would come to this." "Then how did you find me?" James glanced at the clearing, his gaze heavy with memories. "Rollick used to come here whenever he was up to something he didn't want anyone to know about. I took a chance, and I'm glad I did." I felt a lump in my throat, a mix of guilt and gratitude threatening to overwhelm me. "James, Before I could finish, Ivory approached us cautiously, her face streaked with tears. "Kristen, I'm so sorry." I turned to her, my emotions a whirlwind. "Why, Ivory? Why did you lie to me about James?" She dropped her gaze, her hands fidgeting nervously. "I was selfish. I thought, if I could make you hate him, maybe I'd have a chance with him. But I never wanted you to be in danger. I swear I didn't." Her voice broke, and she looked up at me, her eyes pleading. "Please, forgive me." For a moment, I said nothing, the weight of everything pressing down on me. Then, finally, I nodded. "I forgive you. But Ivory, if you ever try to manipulate me again—" "I won't," she promised quickly. "Never again." James stepped forward, his presence grounding me. "Kristen, I owe you an apology too. for not fighting harder to tell you the truth, for letting you believe I said those awful things. Tears welled up in my eyes. James, I was so cruel to you. I pushed you away when you were only trying to help. He gave me a small, tired smile. It doesn't matter now. What matters is that you're safe. The sincerity in his voice made my chest tighten. I took a step closer to him, my voice barely above a whisper. You broke your promise, didn't you? You said you'd never transform again. James nodded, his expression somber. I did. But only because you're worth it. And this was the last time. His words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. I felt a warmth spread through me, a flicker of hope in the midst of all the chaos. As the three of us stood there, the forest around us seemed to breathe again. The tension lifted, replaced by the distant sound of birdsong. The nightmare was over, and for the first time in days, I felt like I could finally breathe. The forest felt quieter now, as if the trees themselves held their breath. James and I stood a few feet apart in the clearing, the morning sunlight filtering through the branches and painting dappled patterns on his torn shirt and dirt-streaked face. I couldn't stop staring at him, the way his sea-green eyes softened, even now, despite everything I had put him through. James, I began, my voice trembling. He turned slightly, meeting my gaze, and something inside me broke. Without thinking, I stepped closer, cupped his face in my hands, and kissed him. His lips were warm and hesitant at first, like he wasn't sure if he should let himself respond. But as I pressed closer, I felt him surrender, his hands tentatively brushing my waist before he pulled back. Kristen, he said softly, his voice a mix of longing and pain. Don't. I blinked, my heart hammering in my chest. Don't? He shook his head, stepping back. You can't fix everything with a kiss. You hurt me, Kristen. His words hit like a slap, and I felt my stomach twist. I know I did, I said quickly, my voice cracking. I was wrong, James. I was so wrong. I don't know how to make it right, but I'm trying. I need you to come with me. He laughed bitterly, though there was no humor in it. Come with you? To what? Back to your apartment, where you humiliated me? Where you threw me out like I didn't matter? I flinched, memories of that day rushing back, the harsh words I'd flung at him, the way I'd shut the door in his face without even letting him explain. I was scared, I whispered, and I took it out on you. I thought you were lying to me, using me. And now? He asked, his arms crossing over his chest. Now I know I was wrong, I said, my throat tight. I was blind, James. I let my fears and insecurities push you away. But I see it now. I see you. Please don't walk away. He looked down, kicking at the dirt with his worn boots. His shoulders sagged like the weight of the world rested on them. I'll never stop loving you, Kristen, he said finally, his voice so soft I almost missed it. Then why won't you stay? I asked, stepping closer. Why can't we start over? He looked up, his eyes shimmering with unshed tears. Because it's not that simple. You may want me now, but what about tomorrow? What happens the next time you get scared or angry? Will you push me away again? I can't live like that, Kristen. I can't keep wondering if I'm enough for you. You are enough, I said, my voice desperate. You've always been enough. Then why didn't you treat me like I was? His words pierced through me, and I had no answer. He was right. I'd let my doubts and fears blind me to the truth. I looked at him, really looked at him, the tired lines on his face, the sadness in his eyes, the strength in his stance. He was everything I didn't deserve, but everything I wanted. "I'm sorry," I whispered, tears streaming down my face. "I know I can't undo what I did, but please, James, don't leave me." He reached out, brushing a tear from my cheek with his thumb. The gesture was so tender it made my heart ache. "I'll always care about you, Kristen. But I need time. I need space to figure out who I am without you." I grabbed his hand, holding it tightly. "You don't have to do that alone." "But I do," he said, pulling his hand away gently. "I need to know that I can stand on my own, that I'm not just a shadow following you around." The finality in his voice made my knees weak. "So, this is it?" "For now," he said, his lips pressing into a thin line. "I hope one day we can find our way back to each other. But right now, I need to go." I wanted to scream, to beg, to fall to my knees and stop him. But I didn't. I just watched as he turned and walked away, his figure growing smaller with every step. The sunlight seemed colder now, the forest quieter. I wrapped my arms around myself, the weight of his absence settling over me like a storm cloud. "I'll wait for you," I whispered to no one, the wind carrying my words away, "no matter how long it takes." And as James disappeared into the trees, I stood there, letting the tears fall freely. For the first time, I realized that loving someone wasn't about holding on. It was about letting them go when they needed to find themselves. The house was silent, just the soft creak of the floorboards beneath my feet as I wandered from room to room. The walls seemed to echo my thoughts, every corner, every piece of furniture reminding me of what I'd lost. I kept playing it over and over in my mind. Everything I'd said, everything I hadn't said to James. I should have believed in him from the start. I should have known that his every action, every word, came from a place of caring. But no, I'd pushed him away. I'd humiliated him when all he ever wanted was to be there for me. How could I have been so blind? The regret settled in my chest like a weight I couldn't shake off. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face. His eyes, filled with so much pain, so much love. And I couldn't stop the tears from flowing. How could I have doubted him? He'd always been the one who cared for me. The one who was there when no one else was. I leaned against the kitchen counter, my hand resting on the edge, as if the cold surface could somehow ground me. I should have gone after him. I should have stopped him before he walked away. But he was gone now, and it felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. "I'm so sorry, James," I whispered to the empty room. Suddenly, I heard the soft shuffle of footsteps behind me, and I turned around to see Ivory standing in the doorway. Her expression was unreadable, but I could see the guilt in her eyes. "I've been meaning to talk to you," she said quietly, her voice hesitant. I didn't know what to expect from her after everything that had happened, but I nodded, motioning for her to come in. "I'm listening," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Ivory stepped forward, her eyes lowering to the floor for a moment. Then, she took a deep breath and met my gaze, her expression softening. "I need to confess something," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Back at the mansion, I tried to kiss James." I felt a sharp pang in my chest, and I almost couldn't breathe. "What?" I asked, my voice trembling. I know it was wrong," she rushed to explain. "But I was confused. I thought maybe if I could get him to see me differently, things would be easier. But James, He rejected me. He said he only loved you, Kristen. Only you. She paused, looking down at her hands before continuing. And he's right. He's the best person you'll ever find, Kristen. He's loyal, caring, and the way he loves, it's real. He's the kind of partner you need. The kind of partner you deserve. I swallowed hard, the tears welling up again. I knew this already, deep down, but hearing her say it out loud hit me in a way I hadn't expected. I was so stupid, I whispered. I pushed him away when he never did anything but love me. Ivory stepped closer, placing a gentle hand on my shoulder. It's not too late, you know, she said softly. Go to him. Bring him back before it's too late. I shook my head, my heart aching. Maybe it already is, I said, my voice thick with emotion. I don't even know where he's gone. And even if I found him, I don't think he'd come back to me. Not after everything I've done. Ivory's hand squeezed my shoulder, and she looked me in the eye, her expression firm. It's never too late, Kristen. Not if you really love him. If you go to him, if you show him that you've realized what he means to you, there's always a chance. I closed my eyes, the weight of her words sinking in. A chance. Could there really be a chance? Could I still make it right? I love him, I said, my voice barely audible. I've always loved him. I just didn't know how to show it. Ivory smiled gently, her eyes softening. Then go. Go to him now, before it's too late. I took a deep breath, wiping away the tears that had fallen, and nodded. Maybe she was right. Maybe it wasn't too late. Maybe if I could just find him, if I could just show him how much I cared, it wouldn't be over. Thank you, I whispered to Ivory, my voice thick with gratitude. She gave me a small, understanding smile. I hope you find him. He deserves to be loved the way he loves you. I nodded, already turning toward the door, my heart pounding in my chest. Could I really do this? Could I fix what I'd broken? But one thing was certain. I wasn't going to let him slip away. Not without trying. I walked out the door, the sound of my footsteps muffled by the quiet night air. The world felt still, as if it were holding its breath, waiting for me to make the first move. I didn't know where James was, but I would find him. I would make things right. And somehow, I knew that if it was meant to be, I wouldn't be too late. Life had taken a quieter turn for me. After closing my office, I decided to simplify things. Working as a restaurant manager wasn't glamorous, but it was steady, and it kept me busy. I needed that. Something to keep my mind off James. But no matter how hard I tried, thoughts of him lingered, like a song stuck on repeat. One chilly afternoon, as I stood behind the counter making coffee, Ivory's phone rang. She picked it up quickly, her voice low and casual. Hello? Oh, hi, she said, her tone warm but careful. After a brief pause, she nodded and replied, Okay, see you then. She hung up and turned to me, grabbing her coat. Who was that? I asked, stirring a frothy latte. I'm meeting someone, she said, adjusting her scarf. Meeting someone? Are you dating? I teased, half smiling. She shook her head, her cheeks turning faintly pink. No, he's just a friend. I raised an eyebrow but let it go. Ivory had a life of her own, and it wasn't my place to pry. Yet something about her sudden secrecy stirred a faint curiosity in me. Later that evening, when she returned, I couldn't help but ask, So, how was your date? She rolled her eyes, laughing lightly. I told you, it wasn't a date. He's my friend. but the way her lips curved into a soft smile told a different story. She seemed happy, and I wanted to believe her, but my gut told me there was more to it than she let on. Over the next few days, I noticed a pattern. Ivory was meeting this friend more often, always with a certain secrecy. She'd slip out casually, offer vague explanations, and return with a faint glow about her. It was subtle, but it was there. And curiosity, that nagging little itch, got the better of me. One evening, when she left, I decided to follow her. My heart pounded with guilt for invading her privacy, but I couldn't stop myself. I kept a safe distance, careful not to be seen. She entered a cozy little restaurant tucked away on a quiet street. I waited outside for a moment, peering through the window. And then I saw him. James. He was sitting at a corner table, looking sharper than ever in a striking premium coat. His hair was neatly combed, and his sea-green eyes glimmered under the soft light of the restaurant. Ivory walked in, and James stood up with a warm smile. She hugged him, and they both laughed as they sat down together. My breath caught in my throat. It felt like the ground beneath me shifted, like everything I believed in had crumbled in an instant. I couldn't tear my eyes away. They were smiling, talking, their gestures filled with a comfortable familiarity that told me this wasn't new. They weren't strangers catching up. They were something else. For the first time, I wondered if James had moved on. Maybe Ivory wasn't just a friend. Maybe they were happy together in a way I could never make him happy. I watched James lean back in his chair, his confidence radiating. He looked like a different man, self-assured, polished, successful. The man I'd pushed away. My breath tightened, the weight of my mistakes pressing down on me. I wanted to storm in, demand answers, tell them how much it hurt to see them together. But I didn't. Instead, I stood there, frozen, watching the life I'd wanted slip further out of reach. Maybe Ivory and James were meant to be. Maybe I'd never been the right one for him. The thought stung, but deep down, I knew it might be true. I turned away, my heart aching. Some wounds were too deep to heal, and as much as I wanted to fight for him, maybe it was time to let go. The logical part of me begged to walk away, but my heart refused to listen. The feeling of betrayal gnawed at me like an old wound torn open again. Ivory had been my closest friend, my confidant. And James? James was the man I couldn't stop loving, no matter how much he hurt me or how many mistakes I made. I took a deep breath and stepped inside the restaurant, my heels clicking against the tiled floor. The room was warm, filled with soft chatter and the aroma of roasted coffee, but my mind was on fire. I didn't think, I just acted. Before I knew it, my hand slapped across Ivory's cheek. The sound seemed to echo, silencing the buzz around us for a split second. Ivory's hand flew to her cheek, her eyes wide with shock. "Kristen!" James's voice boomed, cutting through the tension. He shot to his feet, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "Don't dare! Not with Ivory!" My chest burned with anger. "Of course you'd take her side," I spat, my voice low enough that only the three of us could hear. "You've already taken my best friend. And now what? Are you trying to get Ivory into your bed too?" Ivory gasped, her face turning red. "Kristen, how dare you talk like that?" James's jaw tightened, his eyes blazing with frustration. I ignored her and turned my glare to him. "So that's why you walked away from me that day, isn't it? Because Ivory has a better figure than me?" My voice cracked, but I didn't care. I was too far gone. "Enough, Kristen!" Ivory's voice shook, a mix of fury and disbelief. "I won't listen to another word against me or James. Not one!" I could see the tears welling up in her eyes, but I didn't stop. "You betrayed me, Ivory. You did it again. And this time you brought him into it too," I said, pointing at James. My voice broke, and my hands trembled. "You didn't tell me about your friend because it was him. How could you? How could you steal him from me?" James finally spoke, his tone sharp and cutting. "Ivory didn't steal me from you, Kristen." He paused, his eyes locked on mine. "You chose Rollick." His words hit me like a slap to the face. Ivory's tears spilled over, and she stood abruptly, her chair scraping loudly. "I can't do this," she muttered, her voice cracking as she grabbed her bag. James reached for her arm. "Ivory, wait." But she pulled away, shaking her head. "No, James. I'm done." She walked out of the restaurant, her shoulders trembling as she pushed through the door. I scoffed, folding my arms. "Look at you," I said bitterly, "taking such good care of your girlfriend." "She's not my girlfriend," James said, his voice low but steady. "Oh, really?" I crossed my arms tighter, my voice dripping with sarcasm. "You think I'm blind? Do you expect me to believe this is just a coincidence?" James sighed deeply, running a hand through his messy hair. "You don't know anything, Kristen." "Then explain it to me," I snapped. "Go on. Tell me what's really going on here." He looked at me, his sea-green eyes filled with frustration and something else. Sadness? Regret? "Ivory came to me because she wanted to convince me to come back to you," he said finally, his voice heavy with emotion. "She told me you'd changed. She said you couldn't live without me. She begged me to give you another chance." I froze, my mind struggling to process his words. "We were planning a surprise," he continued, his voice softening. "For your birthday next week. We wanted to show you that people still care about you. That I still care." My breath caught in my throat, and my arms fell to my sides. "But look at you now," he said, his voice trembling. "You're the same. You haven't changed, Kristen. Not one bit." The weight of his words crushed me. My knees felt weak and my heart raced. "Are you serious?" I whispered, tears blurring my vision. James nodded, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Ivory was trying to help you. She cares about you more than you know." The guilt hit me like a freight train. I didn't know," I stammered. "James, I'm sorry, But he didn't let me finish. His eyes, now brimming with tears, told me everything he couldn't say out loud. Without another word, he turned and walked away, leaving me standing there, broken and alone. I sank into a nearby chair, my hands shaking. I had ruined everything. The only chance I had left, and I destroyed it. The restaurant felt cold now, the hum of voices around me distant and hollow. All I could hear was the echo of his words. "You haven't changed, Kristen. Not one bit." I buried my face in my hands, the tears finally spilling over. What had I done? When I got home, the air felt heavier than usual. The soft hum of the fridge was the only sound in the apartment. Then I saw her, Ivory, standing by her bed, throwing her clothes into a suitcase. My heart sank. "Ivory," my voice cracked, barely above a whisper. She didn't look at me. Her movements were sharp, angry. She zipped her suitcase with force and turned toward me. Her eyes were red, but they weren't teary anymore. "I'm sorry," I said, my voice trembling. "Please, don't go. I messed up, okay? I know I hurt you." Her laugh was cold, almost bitter. "You know, Kristen, maybe it would have been better if James had kissed me, or done even more, Like you were accusing us of in that restaurant." My stomach twisted at her words. "Because," she continued, her tone cutting like a knife, "you don't deserve James. You never did." Her words hit me square in the chest, but she wasn't done. "And you know what?" She tilted her head, her lips curling into a mocking smile. "I do have a better figure than you, but it doesn't matter, does it? Not to James, because you can't understand him. You can't even understand me." I felt her words burrow deep into my heart, each one cutting deeper than the last. But I didn't argue. I didn't defend myself. I just stood there, silent, because she was right. Ivory grabbed her suitcase and brushed past me, her shoulder grazing mine. "Goodbye, Kristen," she said flatly, not looking back. The door clicked shut, and just like that, she was gone. I sank to the floor, the emptiness of the apartment swallowing me whole. My chest ached as tears streamed down my face. I felt hollow, like every piece of me had been ripped apart. The night dragged on, and I locked myself in my room. I didn't eat, didn't drink. The bed felt too big, the air too cold. I curled up, staring at the blank wall. The next morning, sunlight filtered through the blinds, but it felt mocking, not warm. My birthday. The loneliest day of the year. No friends. No family. Just me and the deafening silence of my own mistakes. The evening was quiet, the kind of silence that wraps around you like a heavy blanket. I sat curled up on the couch, staring at the flickering candle on the coffee table. It was the only celebration I had. A single, pathetic candle on a cupcake. I didn't even feel like blowing it out. Then, a knock at the door broke the silence. My heart jumped. I wasn't expecting anyone. The air felt colder suddenly, prickling my skin. I stood slowly, my feet dragging as I walked to the door. When I opened it, my breath hitched. A towering creature stood before me, its eyes glowing a terrifying gold, its fur bristling under the faint streetlight. It growled low, a sound that rattled in my chest. I stumbled back, my hands gripping the doorframe for support. This is it, I thought. My end. Before I could scream, the werewolf stepped forward, its body beginning to shift. The fur receded, the snout shortened, and suddenly, standing in its place was James. "Surprise!" Ivory's voice rang out behind him, her laughter filling the tense air. I blinked, my legs trembling. "What? What's going on?" James stepped inside, his warm, familiar smile easing the terror in my chest. "Happy birthday, Kristen." Ivory appeared behind him, grinning ear to ear. "You should have seen your face. Priceless," she said, clutching her stomach as she laughed. Behind them, a small group of people, friends I didn't even know I had, piled in, carrying balloons, cake, and a stack of gifts. My living room transformed in an instant, buzzing with energy and laughter. I stood there, stunned, my mind racing to catch up. Ivory came up to me, her eyes softer now. "I wasn't going to let you spend your birthday alone, Kristen," she said gently. "We wanted to make it special." Tears welled up in my eyes as I looked at her, at James, at the room full of smiling faces. I don't even know what to say." James stepped closer, his sea-green eyes locking onto mine. "Maybe start with sorry," he teased, though his voice held a note of seriousness. "I'm so sorry," I said, my voice breaking. "To both of you. I was horrible, and I hurt you. I don't deserve this." Ivory rolled her eyes dramatically. "Oh, stop being so dramatic," she said, pulling me into a tight hug. "We all make mistakes. Just don't make me regret coming back, okay?" I laughed through my tears, holding her close. The party went on, laughter and music filling the apartment like it hadn't in years. But amidst it all, my eyes kept drifting to James. He stayed close, but not too close, as if he was waiting for me to make the first move. Finally, as the night wound down, we found ourselves on the balcony, the cool air wrapping around us. "I only love you, Kristen," James said softly, his voice steady and sure. "I've never cheated, and I never will. But I can't keep proving myself over and over. You need to trust me." "I do," I said, my voice trembling. "I swear I do. I let my insecurities get the better of me. I promise I'll never doubt you again. Or Ivory." A small smile tugged at his lips. "Good, because I was starting to think you didn't want me anymore." Before I could respond, Ivory popped her head out of the door. "Kristen," she said, grinning mischievously, "before I kiss James, you better do it first." I laughed, my cheeks flushing. Without hesitation, I turned to James, leaning in and pressing my lips to his. His arms wrapped around me, pulling me close, and for the first time in a long time, everything felt right. As we pulled apart, Ivory clapped dramatically. "Finally," she said, laughing. I turned to her, smiling. "Come here," I said, pulling her into a hug. In that moment, surrounded by the people who cared about me, I realized that even the darkest times can lead to the brightest moments.